Good evening and welcome to From the Stacks with the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship Creation. I'm Cal Beisner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance, and we think we've got an exciting show for you this evening. Everybody else vilifies carbon dioxide. We think it's something to celebrate. We're going to be discussing that tonight with Dr. Will Happer, and more about him and from him in just a little bit. I want to mention to you, first of all, that throughout the month of August, the Cornwall Alliance is delighted to offer as our thanks when you make a donation of literally any size and ask for it, this wonderful study called Not in Our Backyard. This is by Robert Bryce, who is a journalist and an expert on energy engineering, energy physics, energy economics. He's quite an amazing man. He's written a number of different books that I have enjoyed very, very greatly. Not in Our Backyard is all about how rural Americans are fighting back against large-scale renewable energy projects being located near them because there are all kinds of harmful effects for the near neighbors of such things. We would love to send you a copy of this. If you would like to request one, all you need to do is to go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply write in promo code 21-08 or the title, Not in Our Backyard, and we'll be glad to send you a copy of this. And 100% of your donation will be tax deductible. The Cornwall Alliance is a Christian ministry, a network of just under 70 scholars. About a third of us are natural scientists, including some of the world's top climate scientists. About a third are economists, including economists who specialize in environmental and developmental economics. And about a third are theologians, philosophers, and ethicists. And in addition to those just under 70, we also have a lot of just plain flat out good friends, scholars all over the world who work in all of these different fields and many, many more. And one of those good friends is Dr. Will Happer, the Cyrus Fogg Brackett Professor of Physics at Princeton, emeritus, and man with an amazing background. And there are many ways in which I would say that Will is a theologian as well as a scientist. He certainly brings theological considerations into much of what he does, but he's also really truly one of the top physicists in America's last, say, 50 years of history. So it's our honor to welcome Will to the program this evening. And Will, would you, I didn't warn you that I was going to do this, but I'm going to ask you just to take about the next, 45 seconds to a minute and a half to introduce yourself. Tell folks about yourself, what you've done, why you've done it, where you've been. I know you've had a fascinating life.
Well, thanks, Cal. I'm a physicist, as Cal says, and I guess the reason I'm a physicist was that during World War II, when I was a preschooler, my mother was the first doctor at Oak Ridge in the Manhattan Project in Tennessee. And so I, as a preschooler, saw all these other physicists and chemists and mathematicians, and they were all interesting people, and they were nice to me as a kid. So I thought, gee, this is a good way to make a living if I'm good enough for it. So I always wanted to be a physicist. My uncle, Carl Morgan, was the founder of health physics, and so he was sort of a model for me too. He was at Oak Ridge most of his life. And so anyway, I've worked at Princeton for most of my life, but I did spend 20 years at Columbia, New York City. Mm-hmm. And where one of my good friends was Robbie, a Nobel Prize winner there, important figure in the history of physics and in also in history in general. He was a close friend of General Eisenhower. And so one of the reasons that science flourished during Ike's administration was that whenever there was a problem, Robbie could pick up the phone and call the president, and the president would answer, and Robbie would say, "Do this and that," and it was usually done. So we don't have that kind of ties anymore. You know, it's too bad. It was one of the one of the positive things of World War II. Of course, World War II was a disaster in terms of all the poor people who were killed, but what it did for America was to create a generation of young men and women who worked together from many different fields, you know, business, science, engineering, you know, auto mechanics. They were all in it together fighting, you know, these evil enemies. And when the war was over, they had this network which maintained American preeminence for about 20 or 30 years until they began to die off. But
Yes.
we've not had that anymore. And to some extent, the draft helped a little bit, but we don't have the draft anymore. So there's now there's a big disconnect between different segments of society. They don't really understand or respect each other. And that's bad for America.
Yeah, it is. It is. I know that you actually had a bit of a role in the Trump administration fairly late on. It was an effort by the Trump administration to improve the credibility, the accountability, the integrity of the science that is used as a basis for environmental regulations under the EPA, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, and whatnot. Tell us a little bit about what you and the Trump administration tried to do there, and you know, obviously with the replacement of Trump in the White House, we don't have that same commitment going on to scientific integrity and environmental regulations. But tell us a bit about what you all were trying to do and what happened to that and what's going on now in terms of scientific integrity in federal regulatory science.
Well, I was actually recruited by John Bolton to work in the National Security Council. He wanted someone with my background to keep an eye on advanced technologies. And so I agreed to come down and help him with that for a year if he would help me to push back against all of the nonsense and extremism on climate. So that was a deal that I could bootleg all I wanted on my hobby, which was trying to restore integrity. And at the same time, I had to, you know, answer the mail that he had. You know, we had many things that had nothing to do with climate that I had to work on. And, you know, fortunately, I had a fairly broad background in many areas of science, and I was able to help. A major issue was the EMP, you know, electromagnetic pulse, and what it might do to our power grid. So I tried to make some progress on that, and I think we did make some progress. But
I hope so.
Yeah, every spare moment, I was trying to push a high-level review of climate. So my idea was to bring in the very best scientists that we could find who would be willing to do a red team review of climate science. After all, it's very important. We're talking about spending trillions of dollars. And so you would think that you'd want to be sure that you're making the expenditures for a good reason. And we do that.
And not just a handful of trillions either, like the current Biden spending. We're talking probably 70 to 140 trillion dollars from now to the end of the century, just the Paris plan.
Right. Yeah. You'd like to believe you're getting something of value for that, and we won't get anything of value for it. Of course, it's a complete waste. And so anyway, I I did manage to convince Mr. Trump that we ought to do that. That I guess was in January of 2019, if I recall. I may have the year
I think
wrong,
so.
uh, but his advisors really didn't want to take it on. And so after many months of battling, his advisors won. Mr. Trump apologized. He said, well, I really can't do this now. There's a time for everything. And if we win the election, we'll do it in the second term. Well,
Yeah.
I said, well, okay. Mr. Trump, I agreed to come down here for a year, and my year's going to be up in September. I got a lease on my corporate housing, and it'll be running out. So at that point, I'm going home. Oh, please stay, please stay. And I said, no. If we're not going to do anything on climate, I've given you my year, and now I'm going home, which I did.
Yeah.
It was
Now, so what is the problem with the use of science by the EPA and various other federal agencies or departments that you all were trying to address? What are they doing wrong?
Well, you understand, Cal, there's a lot of junk science that is supported by the government, and a lot comes out of EPA, but other agencies too. And
Sure.
they want to do this or that, some regulation or another, and sometimes the regulation makes sense. None of us want to be poisoned by real pollutants. In many cases, however, there is no problem. It's simply a power grab by the deep state. It tends to do that. That's the nature of states. And so we and a number of your friends were there. David Legates tried hard, and others, Patrick Michaels, tried to push back on some of these nonsensical regulations. And but it was very difficult because, of course, the media was immediately in an attack mode, and they, if you look at what they do, they never discuss what's being regulated or whether it makes any sense to regulate it, whether there's a dose response curve, for example, which you would hope there is. Often there is not. So instead, it's ad hominems. These guys are paid off by evil manufacturers, by fossil fuel interests or this interest or that interest. All of it was a lie, but how is the public supposed to know when you have the Washington Post, the New York Times, the major news networks, parroting this stuff?
I've been in this for 16 years now. I'm still waiting for my first check from ExxonMobil. And it's never going to come. One of the problems I understand was that one of the things that you all were targeting was the use of scientific research where the researchers were not making their raw data, their computer code, the other pieces of their research available for review and replication or falsification. How common is that, and why is that such a crucial issue?
Well, you put your finger on a very important point. Is science is supposed to be based on observational and experimental data. It's not based on theory. You don't write down an equation for environmental health or for climate or something like that. You think you understand how it works, but the touchstone is how does what you predict agree with observations. And if you don't have observations, if you don't have data, you can't tell. This is a particular problem in epidemiology, where you have to look at, thousands, tens of thousands of patients, even more, and try and figure, this particular size particulate gets bigger, does that affect their health? And what are the confounding factors that might also affect their health? And
Yeah.
you can do epidemiology correctly. One of my heroes there is Jim Instrom, a very good
Yes. Great guy.
epidemiologist from UCLA, and there are
Mhm.
others. Uh, but EPA in particular refused to share data, so you couldn't tell whether some regulation they were proposing, supposedly to help people's health, really had anything to do with their health, because there was no way to check. And if you
Hmm.
can't look at the original data, you can't tell. And so they would raise all sorts of smoke screens, that the their privacy issues, people signed up for privacy and now we're violating that. It was all bogus, it's stuff you could easily have
Yeah.
gotten around. Yeah.
Yeah.
A similar
Yeah.
thing happened in climate, with the infamous hockey stick, where people, when they really started to look at it, say, where's the data for the hockey stick? And,
Yeah.
the main proponent, Michael Mann, refused to share the data. And
Right. Right.
so this was worrisome. How can you tell if the hockey
Yeah.
stick is right if you can't see the raw data? And
Yeah.
so the real hero there was Steve McIntyre, a Canadian,
Yes.
and Robert
Yeah.
Kittrick, who I think was in the Cornwall Alliance for a while. And
Yes, and remains a good friend. Yep.
yeah, right. So, but Steve McIntyre in particular was a real bulldog, and he eventually pulled out all the data. And when you finally were able to see the data, there was nothing there. It was the hockey stick was just made up. It was invented. So
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
they need it, because you have to convince a scientifically illiterate public, scientifically illiterate politicians that there's a climate emergency. And a hockey stick
Right.
is a pretty good way to do that. It looks kind of threatening, but it isn't
Yep.
true, So,
Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
we're just about to turn to to a wonderful presentation that you made recently for the Irish Climate Science group. I've forgotten the exact name of it. They go by Clintel. We're about to turn to that, but I just noticed that we have a comment on our YouTube channel that is a great example of exactly what you mentioned a little bit ago, Will. That is ad hominem attacks. A fellow named Ron Martin writes there, you aren't getting your check from ExxonMobil since they're smart enough to launch their contributions to you through the Heartland Institute. Well, Mr. Martin, before you make accusations, you ought to check your facts. The fact is, we've never received a penny from the Heartland Institute. Now, when they've asked me to speak for their conferences, they've paid my travel expenses, but that's all. No, I've never received a penny from the Heartland Institute, though I do voluntarily give them some advice from time to time, consult with them on various ideas. And the fact is, Mr. Martin, that you are lying through your teeth, and you ought to be ashamed. Okay, now enough of that. I don't usually get quite that way, but I think this kind of thing just stinks, and it ought to be called for what it is. Now, Will, you did recently a wonderful presentation for Clintel called Greenhouse Effects of Methane, Nitrous Oxide, and Carbon Dioxide. And, I'm sure that a lot of folks would think, what? How in the world can that be wonderful? It's not exactly a scintillating title, but it actually introduces a scintillating discussion that you made. It's helpful for folks to understand that a major part of your specialty in physics for, I guess, about 30 years or so, maybe a bit more than that, maybe 40 years, has been the physics of heat transfer and particularly, uh, I don't even know how to describe it. You better do it for us, but it has to do with the absorption of heat and the re-emission of it from molecules in the atmosphere, um, and a lot of dealing with solar radiation, with light, and how that passes through the atmosphere and so on. Give folks just a quick introduction to that, because I think a lot of people don't realize that one doesn't have to be a climate scientist specifically to have insights on what is really the most fundamental issue when we're talking about greenhouse warming.
Well, thanks, Cal. The fundamental issue is that the sun heats the Earth's surface every day, and that energy from the sunlight has to go somewhere, and the only place it can go is back into outer space. And the way it gets to outer space is it's radiated by molecules, greenhouse molecules, radiated by the surface of the Earth in clear skies, radiated by clouds. But radiation is all there is if you want to get to space. However, it's a long way from the surface where we live to outer space. And so, for example, during the summer day when the sun is shining, most of the heat transfer.
Pause just a second, Will. We have slide number 5 out of your presentation on this. This is one that might help demonstrate this for our viewers.
Okay, this is helpful. This is a NASA slide. I think maybe Turnberth produced it. I'm not sure, but anyway, it shows that the Earth is heated by the sun, and a fair fraction of the sun actually gets all the way to the surface of the Earth and heats it up. You familiar with that? You can lie out in the sun on the beach and you feel yourself getting warm from the sun, and that energy has to get back to space. And so the energy of the ground, the warm ground, is transferred upward by 2 processes. One is the fact that there is air blowing along the ground, and so there are thermal, plumes of hot air going up. Balloonists like to ride them, or not so much balloonists, but sailplaners. Balloonists don't like to be in plumes. And there's radiation going up. And I think many of you remember from your school years that there are 3 ways that heat can be transferred. One is radiation, which is the only thing that works for outer space. The other is by convection. This is warm air moving, and that's how many of us heat our home. I heat my home with a hot air system, or I cool it with a cool air system, and so it's the moving air that carries the heat. And finally, there's conduction. Conduction is not really important for Earth climate. It's very inefficient compared to convection and radiation. So you can think of convection and radiation a little bit like a football game. If you're moving the ball down field, you can run it, that's like convection, or you can pass it, and that's like radiation. You make a lot of progress by passing than by running it, but often you do both, and that both are occurring in the lower part of the atmosphere, the so-called troposphere. That's where there is all of this churning air that's driven by solar heating of the ground. So that now the release of this heat at the top of the atmosphere is partially influenced by greenhouse gases, and the most important greenhouse gas by far is water vapor. But second is CO2, carbon dioxide, and then methane and nitrous oxide are really bit players, but they're important because they're being used to beat up on farmers and agriculturalists and ranchers. So we can talk a little bit about that. But it's true that all of these green gases diminish the amount that you can radiate to space if you don't change something else. But what they don't tell you is that the amount that you diminish it is trivially small. It's about 1%, if you double CO2, and it's much less if you double methane or double nitrous oxide. So we're talking about a sort of a non-event that's been demonized since the public is not very literate, technically or scientifically. They get away with it. And so
Yeah.
everybody thinks they understand that. Nobody really understands it. Even scientists who ought to know better have not taken the trouble to really look at it. But I guarantee you that, half the physicists at Princeton could not give you a straight answer for how the greenhouse effect works. I know because I've talked to them.
Right. Yeah, I think it's helpful for lay people to get an idea of how minute the role of carbon dioxide is by realizing that at 419 parts per million, which is roughly what it is right now, that's 42 hundredths of 1%, pardon me, 42 thousandths of 1% of the atmosphere. And
Mhm.
that's just an incredibly small amount. It doesn't mean that it doesn't warm the atmosphere at all. It just means that as a part in a much larger system, it's a pretty small part. And in fact, historically, what we find is that temperature changes before CO2 on very long time scales, on medium time scales, and on short time scales. And that's largely because as the temperature of the oceans changes, as they warm, they exhale CO2, and as they cool, they inhale CO2. But I think a lot of the public doesn't recognize that. All right, so we're going to try to just sort of skip through your Clintel presentation here. Going to jump to slide number 8, where you just show these 4 different greenhouse gas molecules: water vapor, which is a major player; CO2, minor; methane, very minor; and nitrous oxide, also very minor. And then from there, we're going to go to slide number 9. And here, this one really requires some explanation, Will. You need to explain these charts to our viewers because these really tell the story in terms of how big a role different gases play and what restricts the role that some of these gases play in terms of overlap, in terms of their IR absorption bands.
Right. Okay, Cal. Well, this is a famous graph. I'm not even sure who made it, but it's very well done. It's a little bit deceptive, as I will explain later, because all it tells you is the transmission of infrared radiation from the surface of these wavelengths here. So 1 micron, a micrometer, 1 micron, 10 microns, 70 microns. So it's the absorption of this radiation as you go from the surface to outer space. So for these long wavelengths, which is where radiation from the surface is generated, so these smooth curves here are Planck radiation curves for the surface at different temperature. The higher the temperature, the more the curve moves to the left. So 310 degrees is this purplish curve. The black curve is very cold, 210 degrees. And that comes up from the ground, if the ground has the temperatures that's labeled here, but very little of it gets all the way to space. So this is the amount that's absorbed. So you can see over to the right with long wave, most of it is absorbed, and most of the absorption is water vapor. So here's water vapor that's contributing to the absorption. Carbon dioxide does help water vapor in this region here. So carbon dioxide is not completely trivial. And then nitrous oxide and methane, you can see down here, are relatively small players. They interfere with, they're interfered with water and other gases, so they are not able to cause as big an effect as they might if there were no other gases in the atmosphere. What this curve, let me just say what is missing from this and what many people don't understand and make conceptual mistakes is this only shows absorption, but the atmosphere is emitting as well as absorbing. So if you look down from satellites, you don't see anything like this. This is nothing close to anything that anyone has ever observed. In fact, I don't think this has ever been measured. I think this is a purely theoretical curve. What you measure doesn't look like this. So remember then, that's because this completely neglects emission, which is of equal importance to absorption.
Okay. Now, slide number 10 is, I think, a very interesting one. And I'd like you to use this to sort of explain to people how this infrared absorption and emission works. I understand that this tries to sort of picture that in the way the molecules function.
Right. Right. Well, okay, a greenhouse gas differs from, say, nitrogen, which is the main atmospheric constituent, or oxygen or argon, because none of those gases, nitrogen, oxygen, or argon, have opposite pairs of charges. So what you need is a plus charge, say the red charge, and a negative charge, the blue charge, and they have to be oscillating up and down. And electric field lines come out of the plus charge and are eaten by the minus charge here. So you can think of this as something flowing from plus to minus. And as these things start to oscillate, then it's unable to hold on to the field lines, and you can tear loose some of the field lines, and these go out as radiation. So the way you get radiation is you accelerate positive and negative charges about each other. And that's what greenhouse gases can do. That's why the structure that Cal showed of, the tetrahedrons and the triangles is so important, because it gives you an idea of where the positive part of the molecule and where the negative part of the molecule is for a molecule with a dipole moment, just one plus and one minus on average. So this is important. All greenhouse molecules have electric dipole moments, and non-greenhouse molecules don't. So that's the difference between them.
Okay. And so this is what happens, I understand, and you'll correct me, because I am the farthest thing in the world from a physicist, you know that. But I understand what happens is that these will absorb a bit of infrared. We often refer to that as heat, though it's not exactly the right definition. But they absorb a bit of infrared, and then they emit that back out. But that infrared was headed out towards space, and when they re-emit, some of it they emit horizontally, some of it vertically upward, and some of it vertically downward. And the part that comes downward,
to good approximation, they emit the same every direction. Yeah, that's a quite good, at least for gases. That's not true, say, of clouds. For clouds, the infrared is strongly forward scattered. So clouds are a completely different beast in this story.
Which reminds me, you mentioned that water vapor is far and away the most important greenhouse gas. And yet, when we say that, we're actually saying water because water vapor absorbs heat, and thus, since some of it is sent back down toward the Earth, it tends to warm the surface of the Earth. But clouds sometimes warm the Earth. Some forms of clouds warm the Earth. Other forms of clouds cool the Earth, and it depends partly on their altitude, partly on the kind of cloud. But clouds are either solid water, that is ice crystals in clouds, or liquid water, that is droplets, tiny droplets. So these function differently, but you put together the solid ice crystals and the liquid droplets of clouds and the vapor itself, the gas, and the overall effect is what, 80, 85, 90%?
I would say if you put all the phases of water together, vapor, solid, and liquid, I think water is over 90% of the greenhouse effect.
Which doesn't leave an awful lot for carbon
dioxide. CO2 or methane or nitrous oxide. I mean, they're not very big.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, your next slide there, slide number 11, you give the normal modes of methane, or CH4. You
Right.
tell us that only the 1,311 centimeter or cubic meter. No, that's not right. Uh,
It's
Bending
wave,
mode
that's
absorbs much
wave.
radiation.
Okay, that's waves per centimeter.
Waves per,
Centimeter.
okay.
Waves per centimeter, right? So
Okay,
the laser
so
wave
what's
is
the
one under
significance of
that.
this?
What's that?
What's the significance? What's the significance
Well,
of this for
uh,
explaining the greenhouse
okay, let me
effect?
say a little bit about methane. Methane is a, you can think of it as a carbon atom, which is the big atom that's labeled C. I don't know if you can see it. And then it's got four hydrogens attached at the points of a tetrahedron. Or another
Uh-huh.
way you can think of it is put the carbon in the middle of a cube, and catty corner across the top of the cube, you have a pair of hydrogens, and the other catty corner on the bottom is another pair of hydrogens. That's an equally correct way to describe it. And
Okay.
this bounces, it vibrates in many complicated ways. For example, the hydrogens can all move in and out together. That's called a breathing mode. And I think that's called the CH stretch mode. You can see that in the upper left.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these modes will have oscillating pairs of plus and minus charges, and some don't. And only the ones with pairs of plus and minus oscillating charges contribute to greenhouse warming. And so the main one is this 1311 wave number mode right here. And the rest are either free of dipole moments, or they have the wrong frequency. They don't overlap thermal radiation frequencies very well. Uh, I, uh, so all molecules are similar to this. As you go to more complicated molecules, this gets to be a real challenge to understand. For example, some of the freons have just unbelievably complicated normal modes.
Okay. All right. I'd like us now for you to take us a little bit back in history. We're going to skip to your slide number 15. And here you have photos of Max Planck and Karl Schwarzschild, two great physicists of the past. And then you have this graph of Earth's surface temperature uh, uh, without greenhouse gases. And in this graph, you show the difference between what the temperature is with and what it would be without some added CO2. And I think this is where we get to what really gives the lie to the notion that CO2 is driving dangerous to catastrophic warming. So explain
Okay,
how we
good.
understand
This is there's a lot of history of physics here, and the smooth top curve, that the envelope of all of them is the Planck radiation curve that was discovered by Max Planck in the early 1900s. And this curve was a real mystery at the time. Nobody could understand how it could fit with physics, because classical physics said that the curve would not have a peak, but it would get bigger and bigger as you go to higher frequencies here. But instead of getting bigger and bigger, it falls off and goes to practically zero. So Planck was the one who realized that the reason for that is that energy cannot be emitted in arbitrarily small amounts. At a given frequency, there's a minimum amount of energy you can emit, the energy of a photon. And when you make that single assumption, and then everything else is classical physics, classical statistical mechanics, you get everything right. You get this curve. You can't believe how well this curve fits. Measured data, you can hardly tell the difference. But this is for a so-called black body. So it would be a body that absorbs all radiation falling onto it, and therefore it emits the maximum amount of radiation that it can, thermal radiation. And to rough approximation, the Earth's surface is a black body. It's not quite, but it's close. Now, in addition to that smooth Planck curve, there's a jagged curve. And that's the curve that Carl Schwarzschild taught us how to calculate. Carl Schwarzschild was a physicist and astrophysicist. He was in the German army on the Russian front in World War I. And he died there, not from Russian bullets, but from some horrible autoimmune disease, which he wasn't properly treated for. But in his short life, he did amazing things. He was one of the first to find an analytic solution, for example, to Einstein's general relativity equation. It's still an important solution that we teach to students. So Schwarzschild showed how to calculate this jagged black curve. And that, by the way, is almost exactly what you see if you measure radiation coming up from the Earth in a satellite. So this really agrees almost perfectly with observation. And what it's showing you is a combination of emission from the surface in where the jagged black curve and the Planck curve are nearly touching each other. That's where you can look directly to the surface. And so you see the surface radiating without any interference from greenhouse gases. So for example, 800 wave numbers, 900 wave numbers, it's a pretty good so-called window where you see the surface. But at other frequencies, you see much less than the Planck radiation, and that's because you're still seeing radiation from the Earth, but it's from colder, higher altitudes. So at low frequencies, you're seeing water vapor radiating, emitting at high altitudes. None of the surface radiation gets through at all at these low frequencies, say below 500 wave numbers, or practically none gets through at the higher frequencies either. And so everything you see is emission at high altitudes by one greenhouse gas or another. The most important being water, you can see here, and second most important being CO2. Now the point of this slide is if you were to double CO2, and we're a long way from doubling CO2, the only effect it will have is to change that black jagged curve into a red jagged curve. And the red jagged curve is almost coincident with the black. You can't see the difference over most of the spectrum, but you can barely see it at around 600 or 700 wave numbers where the red arrow is pointing. And so you're going to spend these, $100 trillion because of the difference between that red curve and the black curve. That's what you're paying for, is to try and keep that from happening. And it's a 1% effect. It's and of course it's absurd. This, by the way, is not temperature. This is radiation. It's watts per square centimeter per wave number. But you can try to convert that to a temperature. And if you do, you don't get a very big temperature rise from doubling CO2. And you can see why, because the effect is so small. It's the difference between the black curve and the red curve. And
right.
No one in IPC.
We have a question from somebody on our YouTube channel asking, what does the y-axis of the graph show? You've got an interesting equation there, but explain that for folks.
The y-axis is the amount of radiation coming up to the top of the atmosphere in milliwatts per square meter per frequency unit. And since the frequency unit is 1 over a centimeter, that puts a centimeter into that parenthesis that has the unit. But it's a measure of the flux that coming up into outer space. So it's the cooling radiation. It's the radiation that cools the surface of the Earth, which is being heated by the sun. So this counteracts the sun. Now, the interesting thing about CO2 is if you double it, you practically see no difference. But if you take it all away, you go from the black curve to the green curve. So the point here is that if there were no CO2, you would get the black curve with the little green curve where the CO2 band is. Even where CO2 is, water is still absorbing water vapor. This has no clouds, it's only vapor. And so the first 400 parts per million of CO2, about where we are now, causes this huge decrease in radiation to space. But But the next doubling, going from 400 to 800, it practically doesn't make any difference. So the technical jargon for this is to say that the effects of CO2 are saturated. Yes, if you double it, it still slightly decreases radiation to space, but only about 1%, if you put in detailed numbers here. So many people don't understand that. The IPCC doesn't like.
Yeah, why is that so? I mean,
like
the
that.
result is a logarithmic curve for CO2's warming effect. Explain why
That's
that
right.
happens. I mean, it's not as if the CO2 molecules start dancing a different dance. It has something to do with the overlapping of the infrared absorption bands for the different gases. Is that right?
Well, a little bit, but it's mainly due to the fact that CO2 is emitting at all altitudes from the surface of the Earth, which you can see at the edges of that CO2 band, uh, all the way to the stratosphere to 40, 50 kilometers where there's a temperature maximum. You notice there's a little spike in the center of that CO2 band at the bottom where there's more power coming up in the center than there is to the left or to the right. And that's the
Uh-huh.
radiation 40 or 50 kilometers from the warm CO2 that's up there high in the stratosphere. Those particular radiation rates are extremely powerful, so it doesn't take many warm molecules at 40 or 50 kilometers to produce that spike. If you go left and right of the spike, I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer to show you, but that's radiation in the lower stratosphere, typically somewhere between between say 10 and 30 kilometers altitude. And you don't get down into the troposphere where we live until you get to the extreme edge of the CO2 band. So most of what CO2 does is being done to the stratosphere. It hardly matters, for the troposphere or for near the surface where we live. And so the biggest effect of doubling CO2 is not some effect on the surface warming where we live. It's very small there. It's of the order of a degree centigrade for doubling. The big effect is up in the stratosphere where CO2 will certainly cause some cooling because it allows the stratospheric air to radiate more efficiently to space. So the stratosphere will cool down,
Okay.
as a result of the cooling of the CO2. And that's a big effect.
Okay.
That's like tens of degrees. It's not 1 degree.
Uh-huh. Okay. Now, want to look a little more briefly at two other slides here. One where you show a similar sort of a graph just for methane. This is slide number 16. And so let's see if we can get that up there. And just real briefly, give us the lesson from this.
Okay, so this is similar to the one before, and you notice there is the smooth Planck curve that led to the invention of quantum mechanics. There's the jagged Schwarzschild curve, which takes into account the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and which is observed. And finally, there's a little section around 1300 wave numbers where you can see some colors. And so the green color is what happens if you take all the methane out of the atmosphere, just get rid of all of it. And the red, which you can barely see, is what happens if you double methane. So again, the methane doubling has very little effect. Removing it at all has a big effect. And so methane too is saturated like CO2. It's already done most of what it can do. I mean, to try and get a feeling for this, I often use the analogy of, if you've got a barn and you want to paint it red and you put a good coat of red paint on it, it'll look nice and red. And if you're really fussy and you want it really red, you could put a second coat on. It won't make very much difference. And you put 3 or 4, it really doesn't make any difference at all, So adding CO2 now is like adding additional coats of paint to something that's already well painted.
Yeah.
The physics is a little bit different, but the basic idea is the same.
Yeah. It helps me, I think, Will, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, just to remind myself, the higher the curve, and I think a lot of us aren't used to talking in terms of a curve as
Right.
jagged
Yeah.
up and down, but that is a curve, right? The higher
Yeah.
the curve goes, the less the less
The higher the
energy
curve, the more heat
being
is
emitted.
flowing. So if you want to cool the Earth, you want the curve to move up. You want the jagged parts to go up as much as possible. So, for
Okay,
example, if you
yeah,
count all the methane, the curve goes up to the green line. It's not very much,
okay,
but that would
yeah.
mean without methane, Earth would be radiating more heat than it gets from the sun. So it would have to cool down
Okay.
a little bit.
I was thinking it right and saying it wrong, which I do
Yeah.
sometimes. So the higher the
Good.
curve, the less energy is going out to space, and therefore the warmer the surface of the Earth is. The lower the curve, the more energy is going out to space, and therefore the cooler the surface of the Earth is. And what you show with the green there is that, adding, subtracting some methane would make a tiny difference in terms of cooling.
Yeah.
Adding
Yeah. It
in red
causes us to
was the
cool
opposite.
a little bit faster. So the surface would have to cool too. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's not a
right.
big effect.
Okay.
They're a very small effect.
And then uh, lastly here is slide 21, where I'm sorry, slide 19, where you do the same thing with nitrous oxide or laughing gas. And
Yeah.
let's just move past that one because it basically teaches the same lesson. But then
Yeah. It's
to
similar.
slide 21. Slide 21 compares levels of CO2 that prevailed since the Cambrian. We've been in a CO2 famine in recent geologic times. So here what we're measuring is the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we've got time under here running to 500 million years ago or a bit more than that. And what we see, here time is going backward on the graph, which is kind of new for many people. But as we go back in time, meaning to the right on the graph, we're seeing more and more CO2, and yet we didn't have climate catastrophe in any of those periods.
That's correct. In fact, the more CO2, all the evidence points to a more vital Earth with more growth, more plants, more animals, because after all, CO2 really is plant food. And the
Yeah.
the the hieroglyphics on the bottom, the extreme right is the Cambrian, and that's from the Cambrian to now is called the Phanerozoic, the title of this slide up there. And that's the
Uh-huh.
geologic era where there are really good fossils. So you can take a Cambrian rock and you can find trilobites and other hard shell things that tell you about the kind of life that lived then. If you go much older than that, there's very, very little fossil record. There's some, but it's nothing like the explosion in the Cambrian that they talk about.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. You can see the geologists were all Welshmen, so they gave it the names of parts of the world. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned about CO2 being plant food, and you have a slide number 23 that just quickly shows that. This is with the work of Dr. Sherwood Idso. This is kind of a classic favorite slide, showing what happens to the growth of a pine tree depending on the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere in which it grows. And you can see very, very clearly over the same period of time, the same species grows much more rapidly with more CO2 than with less CO2. So that's just a good quick illustration. But your next slide, number 24, shows what's actually happening over the last 40, 50 years or so. I guess this shows actually from 82 to 2010, but it's continuing. Explain what people are seeing here.
Well, this is satellite measurements of leaf cover on the Earth, basically. They're looking at chlorophyll. And green means the leaf cover is increasing. And red means, or orange means it's decreasing. And so you can see over most of the Earth, uh, there is greening, there's more plant growth. And that's especially true in dry areas. So the southern Sahara, the Sahel, you can see as greening very dramatically. And Western Australia, which is very dry, is greening. And Western US and Canada are greening. And Western India. Um, and this is the effect of more CO2. You can try and make sure that there is not more rainfall or not more fertilizer or some other thing that might have caused this, but those have been taken out of this as best uh, can be done. And so it's pretty clear that this is due to CO2. And as
Yeah.
Cal said, this has continued. I mean, people continue to measure this in hopes that it will stop, but in fact, it's getting better and better. So the whole
Yeah.
world is getting greener. Despite all of the demonization of CO2, the only real effect it's had been to make the world greener. It's bad if you're, say, in the forestry business because it's decreased the price for timber because forests are growing faster. So if you're not in a period like now where nobody's working and you can't get timber, the price is going down because trees are growing
Yeah.
faster. That's very, very
Now, this
striking, for example, Finland.
Yeah, this is a slide that I think really deserves a little discussion of the practical consequences. I mean, this is not just sort of, geeky scientist speak or something. This has some really, really practical consequences for those who are concerned about human well-being and about the well-being of the rest of life on Earth. What this shows is that as you add CO2 to the atmosphere, plants grow better. They grow better in wetter and drier soils, in warmer and cooler temperatures. They resist diseases and pests better. They improve their fruit to fiber ratio. The consequence of all of that is that the plants themselves not only grow more densely in a given location, but they also expand their ranges. They can grow in warmer and cooler temperatures, so they can move toward the poles. They can move higher in altitude. They can grow with more and less water, so they can move into wetter and drier places. And that means that everything that eats plants benefits as well. And those things that depend on particular kinds of plants, as those plants increase their ranges, the animals, the birds, and whatnot that depend upon those can increase their ranges as well. So if we're concerned about biodiversity, if we're concerned about not driving various species extinct, this is really, really good news. And it's also great news for human beings because what all this means is that you get higher crop yields and you can grow crops in more places than you could before. And that makes food more abundant. And as something rises in supply relative to demand, price falls, and that makes food more affordable for everybody. But the ones who benefit from that more than anybody else are the poor. This is the kind of thing that, frankly, is what motivates me to do my work leading the Cornwall Alliance, is that I'm concerned about the impact of environmental policy on the world's poor. And unfortunately, a lot of it is very harmful to the poor, partly because it would, in terms of trying to fight climate change by reducing CO2 emissions, it would deprive them of this impact on crop yields, and partly because they frankly need the reliable, the scalable, the instant on demand benefits of electricity at affordable prices. And the best way we get that is either from fossil fuels or from nuclear and run of river hydro. And wind and solar just simply cannot provide the reliable 24/7, 365, dispatchable, scalable electricity that's needed to lift and keep entire societies out of poverty. So, this I think is a slide that has enormous practical implications.
Yeah, I agree, Cal. I mean, in fact, the only clear thing that CO2 has done is had no effect on extreme weather, had no effect to speak of on temperature, but it has really increased agricultural productivity and plant productivity in general. So
Yeah.
we
In
should be
fact,
grateful.
Sherwood Idso's son, Craig, who worked along with him, another PhD with the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. Craig did a masterful study almost a decade ago now on the benefits of more CO2 in the atmosphere. And one of his conclusions was that the value of added crops harvested from 1960 to 2012 solely because of added CO2 in the atmosphere, not counting any of the other reasons that we got more crops, grown, but the value added just by CO2 was about $3.2 trillion. And if you then project out to 2050, based on the IPCC's predictions about how much more CO2 we would add to the atmosphere, you'd get another $9.2 trillion worth of crop yield just because of added CO2 in the atmosphere. I think that's wonderful, and it truly ought to be celebrated, which is what we've called this particular program, why you ought to celebrate increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. All right, we've got two more slides that I'd like you to talk about. Slide number 25, Will, is called Global Warming Models Don't Work. I think that this was a slide that was developed in part by John Christie and Roy Spencer over at the University of Alabama. Roy is a senior fellow and board member with the Cornwall Alliance. Or at least it reflects some of what they've done. But explain to people what this shows about the reliability of the computer climate models in terms of predicting future global temperature.
Well, thanks, Cal. Roy Spencer and John Christie are real heroes for developing the satellite method for measuring the Earth's temperature, the atmospheric temperature in particular. And so what this is showing is the satellite measurements of the temperature in the, mid-troposphere, which is the green wiggly line, thick green wiggly line on the bottom. And in addition to that, there is a purple line that's almost the same, and I believe that's from radiosondes, where you launch balloons and they send down a radio signal which tells you what temperature they measure as they go up. Temperature drops rapidly as you go up in altitude. So that's pretty good ground truth. They agree well with each other, but they don't agree with models, which is the spaghetti that's above them. These are all the complicated, expensive models that the world is paying for, to forecast future temperatures. The models are predicting at least twice as fast warming as is being observed for the most part. I'm not, the purple curve actually may be the Russian model. There is one model that actually sort of works.
Yeah, it is the Russian model.
I'd have to double check on that. Yeah. Anyway, the message is most models predict far too much warming from CO2. And, that's a real problem for the alarmists, because if the warming is really so modest, and by the way, if you look at this, the green curve is actual measurements, everything else is a model. Nobody knows how much of that increase is due to CO2, how much is simply a recovery from the Little Ice Age, because we're coming out of an extremely cold period from 1600s, 1700s that had nothing to do with added CO2. It just ran at ran itself out and then began to warm, late 1700s, early 1800s. And so that's probably a partial contributor to whatever warming we've seen over the past, from 1975 to 2020, the scale on this graph. So the message is what it says on the top of the view graph. The models don't work, and yet we're making momentous policy decisions based on models that don't work, right? We would never do that, for example, with a weapon system. If you buy a ship that sinks when you launch it, you won't buy too many. But here we're buying these computer models that have all essentially sunk, and there's no retribution.
Yeah, and a few months ago, Dr. Spencer published on his blog an interesting story about the fact that the newer generation of computer models, CMIP 6, this graph shows CMIP 5, the newer generation is even worse than the old one. The difference between the model projections and the actual measured temperatures over the past is worse than what it was here. You'd think that after spending billions of dollars, we would be getting better models, but we're getting worse models. And since the models are the only basis for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, making predictions about future temperature, and we know that the models are wrong, what that means is that there's no rational basis for those predictions. There's no rational basis for any kind of a policy in response to those predictions. And therefore, what makes the best sense to do about it right now is nothing in terms of policy. A whole lot more study, I think, is totally justified. I have fallen down on my job here in that I just kind of get carried away with these things sometimes. But a part of my job, frankly, is to raise money for the Cornwall Alliance. And we do that from individual donations. Ron Martin, we do not get money from any of the fossil fuel corporations or anything like that. Our support comes from individual donors. And as a matter of fact, this month, we have two individuals who have very, very generously pledged to match donations. One will match anything up to $5,000, and another will match anything up to $25,000. That is in combined donations from other donors. And so for the first 5,000 donated this month in response to this, we'll see that tripled. And for the next 20,000 donated, we'll see that doubled. So this is an opportunity, if you would like to support the Cornwall Alliance, to see anything you give tripled or perhaps doubled in this month. And when you do that, if you would like to have a copy of this study, Not in Our Backyard, about how rural Americans are fighting back against the location of major, massive renewable energy projects close to them, we'll be glad to send you a copy of this. So to do this, just go to cornwallalliance.org online, cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you're filling out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply write in promo code 21-08, that's for 2021, the 8th month, August, or the title, Not in Our Backyard, and we will be glad to send you a copy of this excellent study. And by the way, the author, Robert Bryce, will be our guest next week on our live stream. He's a fascinating guy, and I hope that you will come back to hear him. Now, we'll go back one more slide here with Will Happer. Your final slide in your presentation was some summary points. And how about if you just walk people through those and give us the gist of the consequences of these, the implications of these?
Well, I hope the slide speaks for itself, but I'm a good scientist. I'm a member of the Academy of Sciences and won a number of awards. So I sort of know what I'm talking about, and I can tell you basic science does not support the idea that there is any threat from carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, or methane. And this is another one of those crazy things that societies eventually sometimes do. You know, for example, we had prohibition in the United States. It was crazy when we did it, and it proved to be crazy when in practice, but we did it anyway. It's worth reading about this in Charles Mackay's book, you know, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and Madness of Crowds. If you haven't read it, by all means do read it. It's informative. So second bullet is, as we've discussed, CO2 will benefit life on Earth because of its value to agriculture, forestry, photosynthetic life in general. And we didn't have a chance to get into the details, but more nitrous oxide and methane, which is what they're beating up farmers for, actually will have a negligible effect on Earth's climate. So it's absolutely shameful what politicians are doing to scientists all over, I mean, to farmers and ranchers all over the world. I mean, Ireland, Holland, United States, New Zealand, you know, they're driving them out of business for nothing, for nothing. So rational people have to push back against this. I've never believed in appeasement. You know, when I see people saying, "Oh well, yeah, we'll work together with the other side and we'll reach a compromise." I don't think compromise is possible. This is just too evil to compromise on. So anyway, maybe I'm too extreme, but that's my view based on many years of watching this.
Right. Well, Will, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Do you have some closing words? I know you just ran through that recap of the presentation, but what would you have to say to our audience in conclusion here?
Well, the main thing is never to give up. And the other side, of course, is trying to pretend that this is a settled issue, that it's hopeless to resist. It's not hopeless to resist. And the best way you can resist is to let your would-be congressmen or senators know that you don't approve of the craziness of the climate fanatics, that they don't speak for you, and anybody who supports them won't get your vote. So by all means, do that as much as you can and as loudly as you can.
Great. All right. Well, Will, thanks very much for joining us on the program again. You were with us late last year, I think, and then was it again earlier this year, I think. So you've been very helpful to us. You're a tremendous advisor for me. I always appreciate the quickness and the depth with which you respond to my requests for explanation when I get in over my head, which is not terribly rare. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Cal.
And all right, folks, thanks so much for joining us this evening. I will mention to Ron Martin, who's written some comments on our YouTube channel, that I intend to write responses to you there, but I can't do it at the moment. We've pretty well run out of time this evening. So come back and look later. I see what you've written. I will respond in writing. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. I pray for a renewal of right reason and of true compassion for the poor around the world. And I pray for many people to come to know the wonderful gift of forgiveness of sin through faith in Jesus Christ. Thank you very much for joining us. Looking forward to seeing you next week.